even if some of you were lured here with promises of gum and other rewards. And we're really excited to share our research with you today. But before we get started, we'd like to ask you to share with us what comes to mind when you hear the word chocolate. So feel free to just blurt out whatever comes to mind when you hear chocolate.
Willy Wonka.
Delicious.
Holidays.
Definitely. Those are examples of things that we thought of too when we began our research.
Well, we're here today to give you a slightly different perspective. It all begins in the Côte d'Ivoire. The Côte d'Ivoire is a country in Africa. As you can see in this map here, the Côte d'Ivoire is located along Africa's west coast and is also known as the Ivory Coast. Growing cocoa requires specialized growing conditions. The first off is shade. Shade is crucial to the development of saplings who would die in direct sunlight. Secondly, cocoa requires a warm and humid environment. As you can see in this map here, the Côte d'Ivoire is located along the equator. This really makes Africa and the Côte d'Ivoire an ideal location to be growing cocoa, and it contributes to the reason of why cocoa is Africa's third largest export and #1 export crop. The Côte d'Ivoire exports its cocoa to a variety of different countries around the world. As you can see in this chart here, the United States receives 20% of the Côte d'Ivoire cocoa exports, which is by far more than any other country in the world. America also imports cocoa from around the world. This chart here shows that 56% of America cocoa imports are from the Côte d'Ivoire. Many American chocolate companies utilize cocoa sourced from the Côte d'Ivoire in their chocolate products. These companies include Mars, ADM, Cargill, Godiva, Hershey, Kraft, and Ferrero. And these chocolate companies produce about 9 out of the 10 candy bars you see at the store. All of these chocolate products here have cocoa sourced from the Côte d'Ivoire.
As you may already know, Americans love chocolate. These are some examples of chocolate in different forms that you might be familiar with eating. And in 2015 alone, Americans consumed $18.27 billion worth of chocolate. West Africa produces 70% of the world's cocoa, but surprisingly, they only consume 3% of that cocoa. And in our research, we found that a lot of cocoa farmers don't even know what chocolate is.
So cocoa production begins with cacao, which is the raw, unprocessed form of cocoa, while cocoa is the main ingredient in chocolate. The first step is planting. Saplings must be planted and take up to 5 years to mature. Once they do so, they have a lifespan of 25 years. When these trees begin to produce cocoa pods, they must be harvested, and the contents must be extracted for the fermentation process to begin. This is usually done under plantain or banana leaves. This process takes about 5 days and is really efficient because of Africa's hot climate. This fermentation process is what distinguishes cacao from cocoa. Later on, these beans are dried, roasted, and ground into cocoa powder.
So, as we already mentioned, a lot of cocoa is produced through the use of child labor. And although it is made with child labor, we do want to clarify that this intensive process of raising cocoa and growing it has paid off. So Côte d'Ivoire's cocoa sector is doing really well. It's tripled in the past 22 years. Despite this success, farmers are only paid $1.74 per kilogram of cocoa, which is about 6% of the price that we as consumers pay in America. Because of these low prices that farmers are receiving, they turn to child labor, which is a lot lower pay than adult labor. It's inexpensive and it guarantees that they'll get more profit. As a result of this huge demand for child labor, a third of the children in West and Central Africa work full or part-time, and 4 out of 5 of these children are unpaid. Child labor is a really important issue for us to understand because it's directly related to the issue of poverty in Africa, and that is directly related to the future of Africa. So we do want to clarify today that there are different forms of child labor, and some child labor is voluntary. One study found that about 96% of child laborers work on their family farms. But there are other forms like foster labor, which is where families send their children to work on relatives' farms. And there's also a form of voluntary child labor where children grow up and travel to other farms as a coming-of-age journey where they gain important adult skills.
Another form of child labor is involuntary child labor, and this is the type of labor that you see negatively portrayed in the media. Boys are often 6 to 12 years old, and other boys are sold by their families because the families can no longer afford to take care of them. They can be sold for about $140 USD. Other boys are trafficked in from Mali, and this is because Mali has a high rate of illiteracy and poverty. This makes it very easy for traffickers to tempt children to come with them with the hopes of better job opportunities or other ways of providing for their families. As you can see in this map here, Mali is located directly north of the Côte d'Ivoire. Because the countries are in such close proximity, it's extremely easy for traffickers to take children across the border. Labor is dangerous, regardless of whether or not it's voluntary or involuntary. Children must come into contact with dangerous wildlife. These cocoa plantations, they're very rural and very forest-like. And in the forest-like conditions in the Côte d'Ivoire, there are venomous snakes such as the horned viper, the mamba, and the forest cobra. And there are also poisonous bugs such as the assassin's bug. Children must also learn to use toxic chemicals. As you can see in this image here, they often do so without the benefit of masks or protective gears. Children must manually apply fertilizers and pesticides around 4 times a year, and when they do so, they're inhaling the toxic fumes they emit. Later on, this causes respiratory and dermatological diseases. Children must also carry heavy loads. An 8-year-old boy can carry a sack of cocoa that weighs up to 100 pounds. Sometimes these sacks of cocoa are so large that it requires 2 children to manually lift the bag and to put it onto the back of another child. Children must also use dangerous tools. In this image here, a young boy is using a machete to harvest the cocoa pod from the tree. But the machete serves a second purpose, which is to extract the contents of the pod. They do so by holding the cocoa pod in their hand, taking the machete in the other, and whacking it down. The cocoa pod has very tough exterior, so they must apply a lot of force when bringing this machete down into their hand. It's estimated that 71% of children in the Côte d'Ivoire use machetes, such as used in this technique, and 4 out of 10 of those children experience wounds or cuts from these sharp tools. There are also abusive working conditions. These conditions are probably more relevant toward involuntary child laborers. These conditions include very long hours. An 18-hour workday from dawn to dusk can be fairly common. Children are also beaten. In this image here, you see a young boy. There are marks, white marks all over his body, and those white marks, they're not bug bites, they're not thorn scrapes, they're actually evidence of his physical abuse. It's not unheard of that some children are beaten to death because they cannot cope with these hard working conditions. There's also inadequate food or clean water. As Vanessa pointed out earlier, these cocoa plantation owners barely make enough money to support themselves. So oftentimes, their laborers subsist on a diet of corn paste and bananas. And because this diet is so limited, they often suffer from malnutrition and are on the brink of starvation. Children are also locked up at night to prevent them from running away. To further dehumanize them, they're sometimes stripped naked, and there are very poor hygiene standards there. They'd be lucky to have a small cup as a toilet.
The media publicizes a lot of images that talk about what Lindsey was just explaining to us, and oftentimes they're horrific pictures of children perhaps losing their childhoods, enduring long, hot hours in the sun, being worked to the point of exhaustion, and being beaten and abused. And while these pictures are definitely horrific to look at, we want to let you know today that these images publicized by the media only share part of the story. And it's important for us as Americans to understand the whole picture. So the usual solution to child labor is legislation in response to these negative images that are publicized. But as a result, sadly, oftentimes nothing happens. So we'd like to share some international legislation that's already been enacted with few results. In 1973, the Minimum Age Convention set worldwide labor to age 15 and older. And in 1999, the Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention outlawed child slavery and trafficking, as well as drug trafficking and any job that could be dangerous for children. In Côte d'Ivoire, where all this child labor is happening, the minimum age for paid employment legally is 14 years, or 18 for hazardous work. But despite all this legislation, nothing has really happened. And one issue contributing to this problem is that legislation is often hard to enforce.
One of the reasons it's hard to enforce is because children oftentimes do not know where they are. When they're trafficked into another country, they don't have the resources or the knowledge to find their ways back home and to explain the conditions that they experienced. Another reason is because cocoa farms are located in rural areas. These areas often have a complete lack of infrastructure. There's no roads, there's no running water, there's no electricity, and this really makes it difficult for government officials to come in and regulate conditions on these cocoa plantations.
So once again, we see that bad images of child labor leading to legislation often result in not much happening. And while we've seen that it's hard to enforce the legislation in Africa and around the world, there are sadly similar results in the United States.
U.S. legislation began in 2000 when the British Broadcasting Corporation launched a documentary called Slavery, a Global Investigation. This documentary discussed some of the implications of child labor in the Côte d'Ivoire, and it caused a lot of public outrage. So in 2001, New York Congressman Elliot Abel decided to amend an agricultural bill. What this bill would do is mandate that the Food and Drug Administration would create a label on chocolate products that certified that they were slave labor free. This bill easily passed in the House of Representatives, and it looked like it was going to pass in the Senate as well. Chocolate companies knew that if this were to happen, it would become federal law, and the chocolate companies feared that this would hurt their sales, so they decided to intervene. They petitioned 4 former senators to lobby against this bill. Furthermore, private companies, including Hershey, ADM, Kraft, Ferrero, Mars, and Cargill, decided to pledge $500 million to improve the conditions of children working on these plantations. Now, this may seem significant, but if you look at the revenue of Mars alone, Mars is the maker of M&Ms and Snickers, they make $33 billion in revenue. So that $500 million combined, it's really a pittance compared to what these chocolate companies make. Because of all the controversy this caused, Engel and Iowa Senator Tom Harkin had to negotiate with these companies, and the result of their negotiations was a compromise known as the Harkin-Engel Protocol, which was a voluntary agreement signed to eliminate the worst forms of child labor. This may seem great, but how exactly do you define the worst forms of child labor? According to this protocol, the worst forms of child labor would be defined according to the International Labor Organization standards. But the thing is, the International Labor Organization had already partnered with private chocolate companies to define these standards. So you can see that there's a huge conflict of interest that exists within this protocol. They decided to set the deadline in 2005. They said in 2005, you're going to see improvements in the lives of these children. But 2005 came and went, so the deadline was pushed to 2010. 2010 came and went, and we still did not see drastic improvements in the lives of these children. Currently, the deadline's in 2020.
So there's another problem. We've already seen that legislation has a lack of results. But the other issue is that bad images of child labor leading to legislation often result in unintended consequences. So let's talk about what some of those unintended consequences are. And we're going to explore some examples in other countries that mirror the results in Africa. So in 1993, the Child Labor Deterrence Act was an international law that was made to fight child labor. And as a result of this law, 50,000 children were released from factories in Bangladesh. And although this seems like really good news, sadly, the result of this accomplishment was that these children turned to prostitution, dangerous street jobs, or just other factories. And in India, similar legislation caused the demand for child labor to increase. So today we'd like to tell you that we need a new approach to understanding child labor. And as we've seen, outlawing child labor is not necessarily enough or the best approach. We need to include the perspective of children and their families, not just our own westernized ideals. We would like to ask you to distance yourselves from the typical negative view of child labor and consider some of the benefits of child labor as well as the reasons why it exists. So one important reason and benefit of child labor is that it provides children with job training and valuable life skills. Working on cocoa farms provides children with valuable work experience. And this might seem strange, but agriculture represents 60% of the work in sub-Saharan Africa. So children need these skills because they're going to grow up and continue working on cocoa farms. Another important benefit is that children gain important skills like a strong work ethic, maturity, and independence that they'll need as adults. And lastly, this also provides children with income so that they can purchase commodities, which gains them community respect. Child labor has another purpose for existing, and that's that oftentimes it's the best use of a child's time. Schools are very expensive for these poverty-stricken families, or they're too far away to attend. A fourth of the children in Côte d'Ivoire quit school by 4th grade, or they never make it to 4th grade because of some of these reasons. And 7 out of 10 rural children, like the children we're talking about, have never attended school and never will. Working on farms trains these children to grow up and possibly inherit their parents' farms. And as we've seen, working on farms is much better than other solutions like prostitution or drug trafficking. Child labor exists because it's a critical economic contribution for many children. It's easy to forget what life is like for people in other countries, but the reality is that nearly half of Africans live in extreme poverty. These people are surviving on less than $1.25 per day. So sending children away to work on other farms can mean that families have one less mouth to feed, or keeping children at home to help on the farm can mean that they're able to feed the rest. 50 cents per day as a contribution, or even per week, is huge. It can represent up to a third of a family's income. And if we simply take away jobs because we think that child labor is bad, we're really taking away a source of income that families depend on to survive. So today we'd like to ask you again to please see this issue through the eyes of these people, the people who are actually experiencing it. Americans are indeed compassionate. U.S. foreign aid in 2012 was $12 billion. So we do want to help. And we should be careful because although we want to help, we're often quick to try to find solutions, especially by enacting legislation and thinking we understand these complex issues. But today we'd like to ask you to practice cultural relativism, which means that we should shed our American views and look at this issue through the perspective of the people who are experiencing it. This doesn't mean that we should ignore child labor. It's a crucial issue, but it does mean we should find solutions that are best for the people actually experiencing it. So, what are some potential solutions? There are indeed things we can do to make a difference. One thing that can help is improving the working conditions for these children. So we want to make sure that these children are safe as they're gaining these important skills and earning income. Another thing that can help is increasing the wages. As we've seen, poverty is a huge issue, so increasing children's wages can make a difference. Another thing that helps is offering scholarships. Research has shown that families offered scholarships are much more likely to send their children to school because now they can afford that option. And another promising solution is work-study programs. So these programs allow children to attend school but also earn an income working on farms that are connected to the school. And lastly, emphasizing the value of school is really important. It's important for families to know that their children can gain important skills like maturity and independence by attending school as well as working. And school provides these children with an opportunity for upward social mobility so that they have access to better jobs and more income. What can we do here in America? So Americans privately donated $358 billion in 2014 to charities. We'd like to ask you to consider where your money goes and what you are investing in. And we'd also like to encourage you to be wise consumers and know the stories behind the products you're buying. We thought this African proverb was really inspiring and connects with this. And it says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together.
There are plenty of chocolate companies that don't use cocoa sourced from child labor in the Côte d'Ivoire. It's demonstrated.
And in conclusion, we want to clarify that we're not asking you to give up all chocolate, as you might be thinking, because chocolate is great and it is a big part of our culture. But we are asking you to please make informed decisions when you can, and also practice cultural relativism in your day-to-day life. So when you see scary images publicized by the media, don't just believe what you think you're seeing, but really try to find out what's happening behind the scenes and understand the whole issue.
Good, because I wasn't going to give up chocolate. All right. Any questions for these people?
Yeah, actually I have two questions. I guess I'm also kind of interested in how chocolate production relates to climate change. So as a warm-up question, I mean, how does chocolate production affect the environment?
That's a really great question. Cocoa farming requires a lot of forests, so oftentimes you see deforestation happening to make room for more cocoa trees. And also, since they use pesticides and fertilizers, you oftentimes see that these pesticides and fertilizers make their way into local water sources. That's contaminated with carcinogens and heavy metals, and can be really toxic to the wildlife as well. they use the slash and burn technique when they're clearing the forest, and that's really dangerous for the environment, and it does release a lot of CO2 when that happens. So there are a lot of environmental consequences associated with this issue.
There was like a second question I had, just for clarification. I think you mentioned Senator, so there's a bill passed by Angles that put labels on chocolate boxes, certificates. And this might be angled more towards the political side of things, but what are these certificates look like? Or can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
So there are three main types of certification. The first is UTZ, the second is Rainforest Alliance, and the third is Fair Trade. UTZ basically ensures that a product is grown in a sustainable method. So if the product is grown, it's not causing soil damage, it's not causing a lot of deforestation and so forth. Rainforest Alliance certification states that the product does not harm biodiversity and it does not harm the livelihoods of the people who produced it. And my partner can expand a little more on fair trade.
Sure. So fair trade was really, it's been a trendy thing in the United States recently, and there's a lot of controversy around it. So basically what fair trade does promise is it promises to offer fair wages to groups of managing authorities who communicate with farmers and hopefully give them also fair wages. The controversy is that according to research, a lot of times these farmers aren't getting fair wages, and only the groups of coordinators above them are. So that's a challenge, but a lot of Americans here think that it means that farmers will definitely get fair wages. So it's important for us to know that that is not necessarily true. The fair wages on the fair trade label are promised to management over those farmers. So be informed. Yes, did you have a question?
I'm sorry, I just, regarding that, do you have any suggestions on how we could eliminate that kind of falling for it? Right?
Yeah, well, I found that actually by reading research and reports on fair trade, and I recommend doing that. It might seem intimidating to just randomly read scientific reports, but there's a lot of them that are actually modified for the public, and they're easier to understand, and they're available on the internet. They're not hard to find. So I recommend doing that if you're considering investing in a product that has a certain label. Yeah, and also I would like to add to that another problem with fair trade is that they actually outlaw child labor. And as we've seen, child labor, although it might seem undesirable, it's necessary sometimes. So I think Americans might not realize that when we're buying fair trade, and we think we're saving people and their children when we're actually pushing them into poverty. So just be careful. Yeah. Any other questions?
Great job.